नमस्कार, गुड आफ्टरनून सभी को। आज जो हम डिस्कशन के लिए आए हैं एनवायरनमेंट क्लाइमेट चेंज को लेकर, सबसे पहले तो टू ऑल आवर पैनलिस्ट वेलकम। माय नेम इज तजीन कुरैशी। ये जो चर्चा है और आज हम चर्चा करने वाले हैं एनवायरनमेंट, मीडिया एंड कम्युनिकेशंस को लेकर। मैं खुद एक पत्रकार रह चुकी हूं एंड आज से कुछ साल पहले तक जब मैं क्लाइमेट रिपोर्टिंग या एनवायरनमेंट रिपोर्टिंग कर रही थी तो एक बहुत बड़ा समस्या था कि एडिटर्स खुद स्टोरीज नहीं लेना चाहते थे, क्योंकि तब लगता था कि क्लाइमेट रिपोर्टिंग इतना इंपॉर्टेंट नहीं है, जितना स्पेस मिलना चाहिए था उतना स्पेस नहीं मिल पा रहा था। अभी चेंज आ गया है, जितना आना चाहिए शायद उतना नहीं, बट चेंज आ रहा है। बट एक समस्या और रही है कि we see all these alarming reports, we see all these overwhelming data. लेकिन as journalists, as communicators, how do we speak, how do we narrate so that we just don't inform people, but we also inspire and empower. So there should be a need for change and action. So ये एक बहुत बड़ी समस्या रही है. It's no longer about scientific data, but it is also about that the voices that we amplify, किनको हम सामने में रखकर लोगों तक पहुंचा रहे हैं आवाज, क्या स्टोरी हम बता रहे हैं, कैसे बता रहे हैं, वो भी उतना ही मायने रखता है जितना हमारा साइंटिफिक डेटा आज के टाइम में। तो स्वागत करती हूँ आप सबका और संवाद ग्रुप को बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद हमें ये प्लेटफॉर्म देने के लिए। सबसे पहले सुबेदी जी आपसे शुरू करना चाहूंगी। पशुपतिनाथ के लैंड से आप आ रहे हैं, जगन्नाथ जी के लैंड पर, आपका स्वागत है। सुबेदी जी के बारे में सबसे पहले तो बता दूं, एक वरिष्ठ पत्रकार तो हैं, ही इज अ सीजन्ड जर्नलिस्ट, but he's also a development professional. He's been a development professional and also an faculty in anthropology. तो सबसे पहले शायद ये सवाल सबके मन में होगा और कुछ स्टूडेंट्स भी हैं, so I should also address the elephant in the room. Today we live in an age which is the age of breaking news. This is the age of short news cycle. We have very few media outlets, media organizations that give space to something like a climate change story or an environment story. From your anthropological perspective, how do you think what we can do as journalists to get into deeper anthropological insights, like let's say community-driven journalism, citizens journalism? So what is needed from journalistic perspective, sir?
Thank you, madam. जय जगन्नाथ। मैं पशुपतिनाथ के शहर से आया हूं, काठमांडू से। और पशुपतिनाथ और जगन्नाथ के आप समझते कैसे वो एक आपस में सामंजस्यता रखते हैं। पशुपतिनाथ इट इज अ गॉड ऑफ ऑल लिविंग बींग्स, पशुपति नेचर गॉड, जगन्नाथ और जगत का नाथ। इसीलिए मैं ये दो जगह का, मैं यहाँ हमारे ऑर्गेनाइजर जो ने हमको बुलाया, मेरा हिंदी इतना अच्छा नहीं है लेकिन मैं प्रयास करता हूँ, इसीलिए आप बोल रही है कि जब हम क्राइसिस में है, कई बार हम ये धर्म युद्ध लड़ा था महाभारत, अभी जो मानवता के लिए सबसे बड़ा एग्जिस्टेंशियल क्राइसिस है वो क्लाइमेट क्राइसिस हो रहा है। पृथ्वी, सुबह की सेशन में भी हमने सुना था पृथ्वी को बुखार आ रही है। पृथ्वी औद्योगिक क्रांति के आगे जो टेम्परेचर था उसके 1.1 डिग्री से बढ़कर पृथ्वी को बुखार आ रहा है। वो बुखार से पृथ्वी का असंतुलन, जब हमको बुखार आते हैं हमारा जो शरीर में जो प्रतिक्रिया होता है वैसे ही पृथ्वी में प्रतिक्रिया आ रहा है। वो उसने होल इकोसिस्टम, होल system of the whole world is impacting. So while as an anthropologist or a journalist, what you talk about people, what exactly is in the mind of people. Anthropologist भी good communicator है, journalist भी good communicator होना चाहिए। Journalist talk about issues that people confront, what exactly is happening on the ground, what people feel amidst the climate crisis, how their livelihood is impacted, how their basic, needs are met in the face of climate crisis that is having a huge impact, especially those subaltern and marginalized people. So as a journalist, you need to know how the horrors in the high mountain in Manang is facing amidst the climate crisis. As a journalist, we need to see how the fishermen in Odisha is having impact in their livelihood in terms of climate change and changing ecological scenario. So you rightly pointed out that things have changed. We need to talk climate change. The best way to solve climate change crisis is to discuss about it. We must discuss the climate crisis. This initiative, I'm so proud of it, that the panchayat, as you are relating to, as you are talking with the community, and how the grassroots level people, when they talk about the crisis, how that would come into a solution. So the role of the so-called elitist, talking about, so the elite language, we must talk with the people, we must talk with the policymaker, we must talk with the government. As a journalist and as an anthropologist, we must talk with the larger global community so that the climate action would happen and the climate justice would be delivered to those who are in need, and especially in South Asia, in India, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, as South Asia is one of the most climate vulnerable countries, and our action is inadequate. And we must make our action in parallel with the crisis. Thank you.
Thank you for those remarks. You spoke about grassroots. Fishermen community के पास पहुंचना है, जो farmers है, जिनके ऊपर impact हो रहा है, उनके पास पहुंचना है, which brings me to our expert here, Rituraj ji. When we talk about environment, climate change, we throw in terms like biodiversity loss. We talk about carbon sequestration. We talk about 1.5-degree target. But there is definitely some disconnect, or it may sound abstract to, for instance, a person at the grassroots, right? So there might be a disconnect between scientific urgency and public action. How do you deal with that as an expert?
I think that's a great question. I think for long we have really looked at everything, all the topics that you mentioned, biodiversity, climate, as well as other issues like desertification in different silos. We never made that connection that one could affect the other. And that is reflected in the fact that the UN, back in 1992, started 3 conventions. One is the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, the other one is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the third is the Convention to Combat Desertification. Now, if you think of it today, these are all interconnected. You cannot separate one from the other. And all these years, across 21 years, it took us to reach the Paris Agreement, the first ever agreement on climate change, and then the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which came about just 2 years back. Until now, we do not have a desertification framework. But I think the most important document that has come out in the last few years is the Nexus document from the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem-Enabled Services, the IPBES, because it talks about the convergence of solutions. And the one solution that we all need to follow, and that was reflected in whatever was said by Mrs. Maneka Gandhi today morning and by my friend Jada Payang, is that we need to love the planet. And the convergence of these solutions come in the fact that 80% of biodiversity in the world is still protected in places that are still native to indigenous people and local communities. Either they are managing those areas or they're living there or looking after them. So the answer is to reconnect ourselves. Forget the 150 years of industrial revolution. Go back to how our ancestors used to live very, very sustainably with the planet, long before that word sustainability came into existence. And how do you do it? You just have to go to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Each of them has between 5 to 13 or 14 targets and sub-targets, and that reflects what we need to do. If you look at the Sustainable Development Goals report, every 2 years they come out with a report that shows that we are not on target to meet anything, any of those targets and goals, except for climate action. But how do you do about it? What's the solution? We only need to follow those targeted areas. You know, it really reflects very beautifully on the pathways ahead. And let me just end by pointing out just one state in this country who actually did a model of climate resilient development. Very, very effective model because they actually broke down the targets to the block level, not just the district. They allocated the funds for implementation, and then they also set up a mechanism to monitor progress year by year at the block level. And that state is Arunachal Pradesh, and that declaration was known as the Pake Declaration, and that happened during November 2021, during COP26. So the rest of the country just needs to follow that model. Thank you.
Thank you. So I picked up reconnect. That was a very important term that you used for this. Now, which brings me to you, Abhishek ji. Urban update, of course, being read by a lot of policymakers, and the session before that was also with the policymakers. We are talking about narratives that shape action today. It changes over time. So today, in the present scenario, what kind of narrative do you think fits in the best? Is it the hard-hitting data investigative stories? Is it the human interest stories? Is it solution-led journalism, which is doing a lot? It's quite a buzzword these days. So what kind of narrative do you think fits in best in the current scenario?
Thank you, Dajin. I will start with one quote of Alfred Hitchcock, famous Hollywood director. He said, "People get the cinema they deserve." I would like to make a little amend in this, because people get the journalism they demand. So in India right now, when our attention spans are decreasing, so the kind of journalism we need, that it should be, definitely it should be solution based, but what is happening exactly that we are not able to create interest in people. हम लोगों में वो इंटरेस्ट जगा नहीं पा रहे हैं कि वो क्लाइमेट वाली स्टोरीज को पढ़ना पसंद करें. एक मैं वीडियो देख रहा था एक वोग मैगजीन का, जब पेरिस में क्लाइमेट अकॉर्ड का डिस्कशन चल रहा था, तो उन्होंने स्टोरीज की, इंटरव्यू किए जो लोग पॉलिसी डिसाइड कर रहे थे कि पेरिस क्लाइमेट अकॉर्ड कैसा होगा. तो वोग मैगजीन की एक एडिटर थी, उन्होंने बताया कि हमने उसी हफ्ते एक स्टोरी की कि किम कार्डिशियन की डेट नाइट लुक कैसा होना चाहिए, और दूसरा एक हमने एक स्टोरी की कि क्लाइमेट, जो पेरिस क्लाइमेट अकॉर्ड है, उसका क्या असर होगा दुनिया पर. जो किम कार्डिशियन की डेट नाइट लुक की स्टोरी थी, उसको 7 मिलियन इन 12 आवर्स मिले, और जो दूसरी स्टोरी थी जिसमें लोगों का इंटरेस्ट होना चाहिए था, जिस पे उनका फ्यूचर डिपेंड करता है, वो कुछ थाउजेंड्स में रह गई. तो एक इसमें भी आता है कि हम मीडिया समाज का आईना होता है, या मीडिया लोग तय करते हैं कि किस तरह की स्टोरीज मीडिया में चले. अभी इसको मैं एक ऐसे एग्जांपल से समझता हूं कि जैसे आप एक रेस्टोरेंट में जाते हैं बुफे खाने, तो वहां पर आपको बहुत हेल्दी एक सूप दे दिया जाता है, हेल्दी डिश दे दी जाती है, बट लेकिन बुफे में दूसरे ऑप्शंस भी अवेलेबल है. आप खाना क्या पसंद करते हैं? तो प्रॉब्लम वही है कि पहले अंडा आया या पहले मुर्गी आई, तो उस पे हमें ये तय करना होगा कि जो जर्नलिज्म हम कर रहे हैं उसको हमें इंटरेस्टिंग बनाना होगा. उसमें प्रॉब्लम क्या है, क्लाइमेट चेंज और एनवायरनमेंट पे हम बहुत लिखते हैं और इसके बारे में बात होती है, लेकिन प्रॉब्लम हमारी है कि या तो हम इतनी ज्यादा टेक्निकल इंफॉर्मेशन उसमें देते हैं कि लोगों का इंटरेस्ट उसमें खत्म हो जाता है। अब आईपीसीसी की आप जब रिपोर्ट्स पढ़ेंगे जो न्यूज पेपर्स में आती हैं या जहां टीवी पे जिक्र होता है, वो दैट इज टू टेक्निकल, लोगों को वो समझ में नहीं आती है। तो वो आजकल जब अटेंशन स्पैन इतना कम है, दे स्क्रॉल। दूसरी चीज, हमने इतना डूम और ग्लूम की बातें कर दी हैं कि हम अब हेल्पलेस फील करने लगे हैं कि अब आगे आने वाले 20 साल में जकार्ता डूब जाएगा, नई राजधानी बनने की बात अभी हमने देखी। अब जब जकार्ता डूबने ही वाला है तो अब उसके बारे में हम क्या ही कर सकते हैं। डूम एंड ग्लूम, हमको उसको डूम ग्लूम से सॉल्यूशंस पे बात करनी होगी। हमें अपनी स्टोरीज को पर्सनल करना होगा। अभी हो क्या रहा है राइट नाउ इन इंडिया, स्पेशली अभी मैं वायनाड का लास्ट ईयर जो इंसिडेंट हुआ, माधव गडगिल ने एक डिटेल्ड रिपोर्ट दी थी कि उस रिपोर्ट में यह था कि क्या रीजन है, कितना खतरनाक हो सकता है जो वहां पे लोग रहते हैं या वहां टूरिज्म एक्टिविटी हो रही है या जो कि वहां वासिंदे हैं उनके लिए। लेकिन मैं रिपोर्ट बाद में पढ़ी, माधव गडगिल की रिपोर्ट के बारे में, जबकि मैं इस फील्ड को कवर करता हूं, उस रिपोर्ट के बारे में मुझे पता तब चलता है जब वो इंसिडेंट हो जाता है और दूसरे दिन गडगिल साहब की रिपोर्ट हिंदू में एडिटोरियल पेज पे छपती है। तो हमें स्पॉट जर्नलिज्म, जिसको मैं कहूंगा स्पॉट जर्नलिज्म का मतलब है कि इवेंट बेस्ड जर्नलिज्म। अभी 10 दिन बाद दिल्ली में पोल्यूशन का बुरा हाल होने वाला है, तब हम बात करेंगे, फ्रंट पेज में आपको एयर पोल्यूशन की खबरें मिलेंगी। लेकिन उसके बाद साल भर क्या, उसको हमें पर्सनलाइज करना पड़ेगा। हमें टेक्निकल इंफॉर्मेशन से उसको इमोशन से जोड़ना होगा। अगर हमें एनवायरमेंट जर्नलिज्म में लोगों का इंटरेस्ट जगाना है, अगर तो हमें उसको वी हैव टू मेक इट इमोशनल एंड पर्सनल। लोगों को मतलब नहीं है कि आईपीसीसी क्या कह रहा है, बट उनके रोजाना की जिंदगी में क्या फर्क होने वाला है उससे उन्हें फर्क पड़ता है।
वेरी वैलिड पॉइंट्स। व्हेन यू से जर्नलिस्ट, बहुत सारे जब टेक्निकल जार्गन्स आ जाते हैं, यू नो द अटेंशन स्पैन टुडे, इट्स द एज ऑफ इंस्टाग्राम एंड रील्स, तो मुश्किल हो जाती है लोगों का अटेंशन लेना। सुबेदी जी, आपसे यही सवाल है कि एक पार्ट में इट बिकम्स टू टेक्निकल व्हेन वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट क्लाइमेट रिपोर्टिंग, द अदर पार्ट एनवायरनमेंट इज आल्सो ऑफन सीन एज बाइनरी, आइदर वी टॉक अबाउट कंजर्वेशन or we talk about development. So either it becomes binary and becomes very oversimplified, or it becomes too technical. Where do we get that balance? Yeah, it's either development versus balance, or it becomes completely technical that he was talking about. Where do we get that balance?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, you know. The question of the global south and global north is now questioning is about the level of development. When in climate negotiations, the global north would come with a certain kind of their prejudices because they are the historic polluters. They are the one who injected lots of dirt gases to our atmosphere, and they should be responsible. And in the global south, the narrative is that, okay, come on, we should go ahead with our development need as well. So I think with the boat that we are in, with the same house we are in, the earth is the only home for both the developed and developing countries. And booking them and bringing them in and making them accountable as well, the global south should not follow the footstep that they did. How we minimize the impact in terms of pursuing our prosperity, in terms of our gaining our economic development. There are ways. The human ingenuity, as you say, the anthropologically, human survived for many disasters in its evolutions. The adaptation is one of the criteria of human civilizations. The crisis, as Pandey ji says, crisis comes, but let's not talk it about gloom and doom. There are ways, human ingenuity, human innovation is there. So the questions that are arising is that how we best balance to our development need without hampering the house, the only house, Vasundhara, Pruthibi. So I think we must not do the mistakes that the West has done. There are clean energy options, there are innovative ways of doing things, and without emitting the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, or the methane, there are ways we can march ahead. So there has to be a delicate balance, and we must follow the right balance. Thank you.
Rituraji, we are talking about innovation. How about I ask you about innovation in your field? You're an expert. For journalists like us, you've been a very good source for stories or, to get you as sound bites. But as an expert, can you tell us what role can you take beyond just being a link between our stories and the people? Like, what proactively more can you do? What innovation can come from the expert side so that the narrative we talk about climate change becomes more connected to people? There is a sense of urgency and action when you speak. So what role can experts play in shaping narratives today?
I think one of the most important issues that we all need to embrace is that it is not limited to understanding the impacts and responses, but we also must equate climate justice with human rights. Each and every one of us, belonging to each and every generation, is a victim of injustice, which started with the, as you rightly pointed out, the Western model of development, starting with the Hudson Bay Company, going on to the East India companies. And now, when we talk about climate justice, it is not just about the historical liabilities of the Western countries, but it becomes a generational issue, it becomes a gender issue, it becomes an issue of biodiversity conserved areas versus the others, it becomes an indigenous peoples issue. So each of us has a story to tell. Within us, one thing that I just give a short example, and I used to be told that, indigenous people's way of thinking or living with the earth is the most important thing. But I got the best example during COVID. You remember the lockdown, right? All of us did not have access to food, and many of us were dependent on the rations that were being brought or handed out by the government. Now, indigenous community areas, people were self-sufficient in the villages. They had no worries about where to get the next meal or the next ration. But the most interesting thing was me and Mr. Jadhav Payang, we are supposed to travel to one place, and he would not take the vaccine. And that time the government made it mandatory to access public transport. So if you don't get a vaccine, you cannot go by flight or by train, right? And his family did not take the vaccine. And his daughter one day called me and said that, how can we take the vaccine? Nobody has ever been vaccinated in our village. And that was kind of shocking to me, even though I also live in Assam, but I live in a town and he lives in a village. And then we went to the district administration, they went to the manufacturers, and they got the clearance, and then he took the vaccine. Now the question is, all of us who grow up vaccinated for health and immunity are, made to think that that's the only way we can be alive, right? Whereas there are these entire communities who have never been vaccinated in their lives. So where do they get their health and well-being from, right? It is definitely what they eat, which is always local and seasonal, besides being nutritional and carbon neutral, but also, how they, carry on their day-to-day lives. They're always happy, no stress. I mean, it is quite a different way of living, and I think that is where we really need to go back. And there are so many stories. We know Jadhav Payang's story, but there are so many stories to be told. I think each one of us, if you look back, talk with your parents and grandparents, go back to your villages, you will find that connect. And that connection should be the spark that makes the world aware how your region, your people are connected to this climate justice narrative. I think that's the way ahead. Thank you.
That's an excellent point when you say we go back to our traditional system of knowledge, which probably has a lot of answers that we are not aware about. Which brings me to you, Abhishek ji. You spoke about gloom and doom concept. You spoke about short attention span. For the mainstream media, it takes something like a Darjeeling or the landslide I'm talking about recently, or let's say the example of Nagarkot in Nepal, to get that attention back for the mainstream media. What about issues like non-economic loss and damage? These are concepts in journalism, in communication, in environment communication that we don't talk about a lot. So, where do you have anything to say, A, to the journalists who are covering it, the serious ones, and not just a one-time thing, and B, to the editors, who get such kind of stories, but then due space is not given?
About journalism, first of all, अभी जब हम बात कर रहे हैं आज, तो बहुत सारे लोगों जब से मिलता हूँ जर्नलिस्ट से, तो ये बात चल रही है कि क्लाइमेट चेंज की अपनी एक अलग बीट होनी चाहिए, एक अलग बीट होनी चाहिए, जैसे एजुकेशन की होती है, सिविक की होती है, बीट एक होनी चाहिए. बट आई थिंक वो जो टाइम था बीट वाला वो जा चुका है. वो क्योंकि आज आप एजुकेशन कवर कर रहे हो, आप सिविक अफेयर्स कवर कर रहे हो, पॉलिटिक्स कवर कर रहे हो, डेवलपमेंट कवर करते हो, सभी का सब टेक्स्ट में क्लाइमेट चेंज और एनवायरनमेंट है. अभी मैं सुबह, इसके पहले एक सेशन चल रहा था, वी वर टॉकिंग अबाउट रोड कंस्ट्रक्शन एंड क्लाइमेट चेंज, उसके बारे में बात कर रही है. तो आज से पहले कब, आज से 10 साल पहले हम कब बात करते कि रोड कंस्ट्रक्शन में क्लाइमेट चेंज का कितना इंपैक्ट होगा. तो एडिटर्स के लिए तो सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट चीज है कि हमें we have to train our media persons for whatever they are covering, whether they are covering development, education, anything, because ultimately it will come down to climate change, because it is here. It is not a distant thing. It is happening. अभी हिमाचल प्रदेश में आपने देखा होगा कुछ दिन पहले बाढ़ आई, तो हमें उसको कवर कैसे करना है, जैसे जर्नलिस्ट से अगर हम बात करते हैं, वी हैव टू मूव अवे फ्रॉम जस्ट रिपोर्टिंग ए ट्रेजेडी. वी हैव टू मेंशन व्हाई इट इज हैपनिंग अगेन एंड अगेन. गुड़गांव में 190 करोड़ के अपार्टमेंट बिकते हैं, 190 करोड़ के अपार्टमेंट बिकते हैं, लेकिन 2 घंटे की बारिश में शहर डूब जाता है. ऐसा क्यों हो रहा है, क्यों हो रहा है बार बार? दीज आर द क्वेश्चंस जर्नलिस्ट नीड टू आस्क. व्हाई दिस इज हैपनिंग, कि 2 घंटे की बारिश में, और बार बार हो रहा है, सिर्फ गुड़गांव की बात नहीं है. इट इज हैपनिंग इन बेंगलुरु, इट इज हैपनिंग इन हैदराबाद, इट इज हैपनिंग इन चेन्नई, डिफरेंट ईयर्स, बट सेम थिंग इज हैपनिंग. सो व्हेन दिस क्लाइमेट इज चेंजिंग, frequent rains and high intensity rain is happening, our cities are getting drowned. So we have to ask this question to the authorities, to the power, कि ऐसा लगातार बार बार क्यों हो रहा है. और इसके लिए सबसे इंपॉर्टेंट चीज जिसको हमें ध्यान में रखना है, हमें रिपोर्टिंग जब भी हम कर रहे हैं, हमें सिर्फ डेटा पे नहीं बात करनी है, हमें ह्यूमन एंगल उसमें तलाशना होगा. अगर दिल्ली में अगर 400 एक्वाई जाता है, उससे हमारे बच्चों के लंग्स पे क्या असर पड़ रहा है, ये हमें बताना होगा. एंड आई एम श्योर when we start speaking in their language, people will listen. Thank you.
थैंक यू सो मच. आपने इंटरसेक्शन की बात की, ये बात बिल्कुल सही है कि आप जो भी सेक्टर, विच एवर सेक्टर यू आर टॉकिंग अबाउट टुडे, इफ इट्स एजुकेशन फॉर इंस्टेंस, यू मेंशन्ड लर्निंग लॉस बढ़ रहा है बिकॉज एक्सट्रीम वेदर इवेंट्स आर लीडिंग टू स्कूल क्लोजर्स फॉर अ लॉन्गर ड्यूरेशन. Sports mein, if you see the turfs that are being used, at least I can say for hockey, which I cover, they're being used with materials now which are more climate resilient. So all these things, all of it is interconnected, as you mentioned. I think we are out of time. But my last comment would be to all our panelists. There's just no one way. I think we agree to this, that there's just not one way to narrate a climate story. It's all about identifying your audience and bringing that connect. It's a very simple rule that we used to be taught in journalism earlier, that if you have to explain a very difficult concept to a generic audience, think that you're explaining it to your grandmother. So if you're able to convince her, then probably your story has reached. So I think it is about adapting to the time, talking about coexistence, and it's also about shaping ourselves, also about making ourselves technically sound as communicators, as journalists, so that the important responsibility, I repeat, responsibility that we have about talking of climate change and environment is resonated among people, the urgency is understood, and there is more public attention to it. With this, thank you so much, all our panelists. It's been a wonderful discussion. Thank you, everyone.